We've been reporting on many of the changes initiated by Donald Trump since he took over as president. But now it seems reporting from inside the White House is about to undergo a major overhaul. The Trump administration says it will start hand-picking which news outlets get to join the presidential press pool. That's a small group of journalists who have close access to Trump, for example, in the Oval Office. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt announced the change, which breaks decades of precedent. Normally, the press pool is chosen by journalists from the White House Correspondents Association. Leavitt said it was time to reflect changes in the media landscape.
As I have said since the first day behind this podium, it's beyond time that the White House press operation reflects the media habits of the American people in 2025, not 1925. A select group of DC-based journalists should no longer have a monopoly over the privilege of press access at the White House. All journalists, outlets, and voices deserve a seat at this highly coveted table.
The White House Correspondents Association has rebuked the move in a blistering statement. It said, "This move tears at the independence of a free press in the United States. It suggests the government will choose the journalists who cover the president. In a free country, leaders must not be able to choose their own press corps." Now, this is happening as concern grows that the Trump administration is trying to limit access by major news organizations to the White House. The news agency, the Associated Press, is suing officials from the Trump administration over an order barring their reporters from the Oval Office or traveling on Air Force One. The reason for the barring was AP's refusal to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, as Trump ordered when he took office. AP says it will retain the Gulf of Mexico as it has an international audience, but would also report the name change by Trump. Let's talk about this with Seth Stern, who's Director of Advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. That's a non-profit organisation that supports investigative news outlets and the freedom of the press. He's joining me now from Evanston, Illinois. Thanks for joining us today, Seth. Can you, first of all, explain to our viewers who may not be familiar with how reporting in the White House works, what the press pool is and how significant it is?
Sure. So a press pool is needed because there's limited space in the Oval Office or on Air Force One, and not all reporters can be there when news happens. So the press pool is comprised of a group of White House correspondents that attends those events and generates pool reports that it then shares with others. And among those the press pool are wire services, the Associated Press, Reuters, and Bloomberg, although the first two are apparently no longer going to be part of it. And these wire services contract with news outlets around the country and world, including metropolitan and local news outlets all over America, red and blue states alike, that don't have the resources to assign someone to be in Washington, D.C. So the role of these wire services isn't something other news outlets can just take over overnight. There are contractual relationships, technologies, and procedures involved. Even if someone prefers a Trump-aligned news outlet's editorial perspective over the AP's, those outlets just aren't equipped to step in. So people all over the country, particularly in areas that are already news deserts, where local news is already hard to come by, they're going to see significantly diminished coverage in their local papers if the wire service that paper relies on is going to be denied access to the White House.
I want to ask you about a point made by the White House Press Secretary, Karoline Leavitt, that the press pool needs to be overhauled to reflect a changed media landscape, that alternative sources of news should have access to the president. Does she have a point?
Well, I'm not here to say that the White House Correspondents Association, which until now chose the press pool, is infallible. They do regularly expand their membership to reflect changes in the media, to go to that point. But they're subject to criticism like any other organization. And people, politicians, can call for changes in how they do things. But what we can't have is the government stepping in to take their place. the government has every incentive, if it is going to select journalists to cover it, to select the ones that say what it wants to say and refrain from speaking truth to power. A press that is handpicked by the government is just not a free press. Peter Baker, who's a New York Times, I believe, White House correspondent, said that Vladimir Putin did the same thing back when Mr. Baker was a Moscow correspondent. Maybe for Trump, that's more feature than bug, but it allows the White House to sort of dangle access over journalists' heads and punish those who don't toe the line.
What do you think is the White House's goal in making this change?
I think the goal is control. I read an article by a columnist I like named Hamilton Nolan about how Trump is effectively operating the way gangsters operate, and this is an example of that. He wants news outlets to be dependent on his whims and favors so he can dictate coverage, both directly and indirectly. And when I say indirectly, I mean this gives every outlet that would like access to the White House every incentive to self-censor and to hold back. And we'll never know how much of that is happening because, of course, we don't know what news we weren't shown. We only know what news we were shown. Nobody's going to admit to self-censoring, but I think it's a virtual certainty that it's going to happen. I hope they don't, and I hope that instead outlets that are kicked out of the White House off of Air Force One make Trump regret it by taking the time that they're not in the room with him to do the kind of investigative journalism that he fears and that he is attempting to stifle through these kinds of antics.
The issue of freedom of expression is often a highly contentious one in the US. What makes this dispute so significant?
Well, the blatant unconstitutionality of it all. The law is very clearly established that although there might be some power on behalf of presidents or politicians to control access, once access is granted, it cannot be rescinded based on content. And we know this all started with the AP calling the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Gulf of America. So, and that's all in the record, very clearly based on a choice of wording. But now we know it wasn't only about what the AP calls a body of water. It was about, again, controlling the press pool, excluding outlets that don't toe the line or that the president doesn't like, even though for now some such outlets may remain in the press pool. I think it's a virtual guarantee that we are going to see this access used to attempt to control the discourse. Practically speaking, as opposed to legally, what is unique about this is the effect it has on the greater media ecosystem. As I said, journalists around the country, news outlets around the country are dependent on wire services and on the press pool to do the work they do to provide news to their communities. So absent that, people are going to be relying on sources that traffic in misinformation, that are not dependable, that are not verified, that weren't in the room with the president. And that's going to be a problem for the state of the discourse and the state of democracy in this country.
You've mentioned AP several times, so the Associated Press news agency. It is suing Trump officials over this barring order from the Oval Office and Air Force One. Can you bring us up to date on that case and how you rate its chances of success?
Yeah, there is a hearing coming up in the case in late March. The court did decline to immediately reverse the order barring the Associated Press from the White House, but did urge the administration to reconsider its approach and noted that the case law is uniformly unfriendly to the administration's position that it can do this. And I agree with that assessment. It is abundantly clear under the First Amendment that the White House, that elected officials cannot punish news outlets, cannot punish journalists by restricting their access based on the editorial slant of their reporting, the words that they choose to use, whether they comply with dictates from the administration on preferred word choice. The president of the United States is not entitled to put words in the mouths of journalists. That is antithetical to everything the First Amendment stands for and is essentially unheard of.
Part of what your organization does is to monitor press freedom violations in the US. You've spoken to us about how this will affect reporting from the White House. Can you give us a sense of the state of press freedom in the whole of the US today?
I think it's fair to say that press freedom in the United States is on the decline. One of our projects at Freedom of the Press Foundation is the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is a database that reports on and monitors press freedom violations around the country, ranging from assaults on journalists, arrests of journalists, subpoenas of journalists, and various other categories. And if you look at 2024, before Trump was in office, you'll see more arrests than prior years, with the exception of 2020 when there was broad civil unrest, more assaults of journalists, and other indicators that the climate for journalists around the country is declining. Another organization, Reporters Without Borders, does rankings of countries around the globe when it comes to press freedom. Again, the U.S.'s ranking there has been steadily declining. And although Trump, through what he's doing with the press pool, what he's doing with the Federal Communications Commission, and otherwise poses a unique threat to press freedom, the problem did not start with Trump. We can look at last week when we saw a Democratic mayor convince a Democratic judge in Mississippi to order a newspaper to take down an editorial that was critical of him. There have been widespread press freedom violations in the bluest parts of the country and the reddest parts. So this is an ongoing and problematic trend we are seeing. Where it originates from, there are any number of theories. Some of it likely has to do with rhetoric coming from the White House. Some of it has to do with the state of local media, the financial struggles local media is facing, providing an opportunity to bully the press. And in turn, that creates a situation where the judiciary is less informed about press freedom because they're simply seeing fewer press freedom cases than they used to, leading to orders like the one we saw in Mississippi that simply fly in the face of the First Amendment in ways that we wouldn't have often seen in prior decades.
Seth Stern from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Seth, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.